Now, over the last few months, the David spelled D4vd case has moved through a lot of different stages. At first, it was intense online speculation about what really happened to 14-year-old Celeste, with constant discussion and headlines coming at us fast. Then it shifted into something more serious: suspect status, sealed records, law enforcement signaling accountability, and after that, things seemed to quiet down, at least publicly. But quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening, because there's been movement behind the scenes. A key witness connected to the investigation was taken into custody before later posting bail. A witness who also happens to be a social media influencer, frequently photographed with David. At the same time, family members are fighting court orders tied to the case. And then there's the Tesla, because something has shifted there as well. Ownership of the car has changed, and new questions are now being raised about what evidence may or may have not been preserved. But here's the part that changes everything. Newly unsealed court documents now describe David as the target in a Los Angeles County grand jury investigation tied to Celeste's death. Not a person of interest, target. The filings state he may have committed a criminal offense in California, which is of course where this heinous crime against this little girl happened. And in these filings, they specifically reference one count of murder, and this is pulled directly from the court documents for this case. David hasn't been arrested or charged in a crime yet. However, when prosecutors label someone a target inside a grand jury proceeding, that tells you where the investigation is pointing. When you take a step back and look at everything together, this no longer...
Hell yeah, man. Ever since this case came out, man, this shit been sketchy as hell. I don't even see how he's not even, he ain't been interrogated. He ain't been interviewed. Not a damn thing. The fuck? Nigga, she was found in your Tesla dead. And it's just been that. Nobody's been arrested. Nobody's nothing. Like, you know what I'm saying? Hell yeah, he a target. You know what I'm saying? The fuck? He should have been the target since day one.
It feels like the same chapter we were in a few months ago. It feels like a transition. It feels like the case has entered a new phase. But what exactly does that new phase mean for the investigation and for David himself?
I was facing a transition that I knew needed to happen, a make or break moment for me to become the woman.
Now, it's almost been 3 months since we last talked about this story. Crazy how fast time flies. At the time, the case felt like it had reached a peak. Suspect status, autopsy records sealed, law enforcement publicly, signaling accountability. There were a lot of things we covered. But since then, even though things seemed quiet on the surface, there have been subtle shifts happening behind the scenes. Before we dive deeper into what this new phase means, let's go back to where we left off, because that context, of course, matters. In the last video we made, we discussed how investigators had labeled him a suspect. That information came from a source with direct knowledge of the investigation, and from that same report, we also learned that David was not cooperating with law enforcement at that point in time. We also talked about law enforcement sources indicating that investigators believe more than one person may have been involved in what was done to Celeste, and that was a major shift in the tone of the case.
I mean, they say her body was like all chopped up and stuff, right? So that sounded like it was multiple people. Because how the hell do you even chop a body up anyway? Like, they got bones, we got bones and hella shit. So that sounded like it had to be a multiple person job to, you know what I'm saying, get that type of shit done.
At that point, it didn't feel like this was about just one person anymore. It feels like investigators were widening the net, trying to understand whether responsibility extended beyond a single individual. And the question, of course, naturally became who else was there? Who crossed paths with Celeste before this? Who might have known something connected to that as well? We learned that the timeline itself may have been a very different one from what people originally assumed. A law enforcement source stated that Celeste may have been deceased for months, dating back to the spring of 2025, even though her remains weren't discovered until September 2025. So that gap raised a lot of questions because we still don't have clear answers about what happened during that period of time. And honestly, that part of the case was one of the most difficult pieces to process. I mean, we're talking about a gap of months. That's not a small window. That's an entire stretch of time where something happened and we still don't fully understand what. We also talked about these sealed autopsy records. As some of you might remember, the LAPD went to a judge and successfully obtained a court order to seal everything connected to Celeste's autopsy. That included the cause of death, the manner of death, the autopsy findings, physical evidence, essentially the entire file. Now, according to the detective behind that request, the reason was to protect the integrity of the investigation, especially given how high profile the case had become. He also stated that releasing those details could expose witnesses or informants who were cooperating with law enforcement in the case. And most importantly, investigators formally
So they basically held back the evidence because they didn't want any of the witnesses, or like, you know, for anybody to get spooked and be scared and, you know, try to hiding the evidence. So they didn't release nothing to the public. So people won't be, you know, try to erase the evidence and, you know, shit like that.
Described this as a murder investigation. Now, given the circumstances, we already knew that, right? But this was the first time it was officially put on record. So that's where things stood at the time, and that's what we last covered in the video that I made. There were a lot of heavy developments, strong signals from investigators, and then silence. But silence doesn't always mean stagnation, because over the past few weeks, things have happened that suggest this case isn't sitting still at all. Let's start with what happened on January 23rd, just a few weeks ago. It begins with a social media influencer by the name of Neil Langston, someone who's been photographed around D4vd, David over the past year and who had already been identified as a key grand jury witness in this investigation. From what's publicly visible, they appear to be friends. How close exactly are they? We don't really know the details. At least they're close enough to take this photo together where David's shirt says, "Sounds gay."
They look sus as hell. He even got the sus shirt on. It sounds gay, it looks gay. Guess what? It is gay.
Hey, and why is old boy smiling in his mugshot like that? I have a lot of questions. But what we do know is this. In late January, Langston was arrested in Montana, and that's because he had an out-of-state warrant after failing to appear as a witness in Los Angeles. So basically, he was expected to show up and testify in this case, and he didn't for whatever reason. County jail records show he was taken into custody on January 22nd. Shortly after, the Los Angeles Times confirmed that a judge had issued the warrant after he repeatedly declined to testify before the grand jury. Neil was eventually transported back to Los Angeles and released on a...
I ain't gonna lie, that's looking kind of suspect. You know, you get pulled to court. You know, you're supposed to testify or whatever, and you don't go. If you ain't got nothing to do with it, you feel me? If you ain't got nothing to hide, why not testify? I'm pretty sure he's not worried about being considered a snitch. Nobody even likes David after this situation happened. So it's not like people gonna label him snitch and this and that.
$60,000 bond. Now, grand jury proceedings are confidential, so we don't really know what was ultimately discussed or whether he testified once he returned. But here's the key part that stands out, to me at least. Grand juries don't usually issue out-of-state warrants unless testimony is considered important. Basically, they don't go through the process of tracking someone down across state lines unless they believe that person has information they need. Now, that doesn't automatically mean involvement. It could mean timeline context, communication, movement, something he saw, something he heard, perhaps. I mean, they were friends after all, or possibly more than friends, according to some of his fans on Reddit. But the fact that the court wanted his appearance tells you his testimony mattered to some extent. And that's the piece I'm most curious about. Why? In early February, just a few weeks ago, TMZ published a clip showing Neil Langston walking into court in connection with the Celeste Rivas investigation.
If you have CalFresh, Medi-Cal, or SSI, you may qualify for a free iPhone 11, plus a...
Do you think David is innocent?
Again, that footage doesn't tell us what was said inside the courtroom, but it does confirm that this process is actively unfolding. Obviously, we don't know what his level of involvement is here, or even if there's one beyond just being called as a witness. But what we do know from previous reports is that investigators were bringing in multiple witnesses as part of this entire case and process. And here's the thing, right? When someone operates at the level that David was, especially in the music industry, since there were a lot of people around him, managers, friends, tour staff, collaborators, etc., there could have been people who saw some things. So the fact that witnesses are being called isn't so strange, and it also doesn't automatically mean guilt. It does, however, mean investigators are building context. Now, a lot of people did question why he initially declined to testify, and I'm very curious about that as well. But the reality is there's a lot of reasons why someone might hesitate in a situation like this, whether it's legal advice, fear of saying the wrong thing, or simply not wanting to be dragged into something this serious, whatever. Now, the witness situation wasn't the only thing that happened, because around that same time, this investigation extended itself into David's actual family. According to the Los Angeles Times, his father, mother, and brother, who all live in Texas, were served grand jury subpoenas tied to this investigation. So basically, California prosecutors want them to testify in this case. But instead of just going along with it, the family pushed back. They went to court in Texas and argued that forcing them to testify in California would violate their due process rights, meaning in simple terms, they were challenging whether the legal procedure was being handled correctly in their case. However, that challenge didn't change much because on February 9th, the court actually denied it. So as far as we know, they're still expected to show up and testify. And I'm not gonna lie, when I saw that his immediate family was being pulled into all this, it made me pause for a second because you don't usually see investigators bring in parents and siblings this early in the process. Now,
Yeah, they went to 411 or 911 on David and that, Celeste girl. The parents probably know something about something. They got to. They got to know something. Even if it's not about the actual death, they know something about, the Celeste and David chick. I'm going to call him a chick. Yeah, David.
But later on during, let's say, a trial, sure, you might see family testify about someone's character, who they are, their upbringing, things like that. But this isn't that. This is still the investigative phase. And when the immediate family is being brought in at this stage, it usually means investigators believe there's something relevant here, whether that's timeline clarification, communication records, travel details, financial movement, whatever it may be. Again, that doesn't mean wrongdoing, but it does mean that they think there's information in that circle that matters to the case. And when an investigation starts expanding outward like that, from friends to family, it's usually a sign that they're trying to map the full environment around a person. Not just what happened, but who knew what and when things actually happened. And that's the part that stands out, at least to me. Through all this, by the way, it's important to remember what this case is actually about. A 14-year-old girl, not a grown woman like a lot of these irresponsible platforms are saying. A 14-year-old little girl, a child, lost her life. That's the center of all this. So just keep that in mind as we go through these details. Now, outside of the official court documents and mainstream news reports, there have also been independent updates coming from a private investigator who's been digging into this case on his own. And what he uncovered has to do with the Tesla, the very car where Celeste was found. On its own, it may not seem all that significant, but when you place that next to David now being described as a target in this investigation, that information I believe deserves some attention. So let's take a closer look at what's going on with the Tesla. So the private investigator's name is Steve Fisher, and we've talked about some of his findings before. Now, in late January, he posted something that caught my attention. Now, according to Steve, who did some investigative work, the car was only held by the LAPD for about 48 hours for evidence processing. Now, he says that it was released around September 10th, just 2 days after discovery, and then sent back to the impound lot. To support that claim, he shared what he described as a release receipt, showing the vehicle was cleared and available for pickup around that exact date, which, if accurate, suggests that from that point forward, the car was no longer being held as active evidence. It was sitting in storage, and that timeline matters because if the vehicle was released on September 10th, that would mean it was no longer in police custody before Celeste had even been publicly identified. And I'm not gonna lie, that's where I kind of pause. Not as an accusation, just as a timing question. Because usually when a vehicle is directly tied to an active homicide investigation, especially one that's being presented to a grand jury, you'd expect it to remain secured for as long as investigators think they might need it. Now, that doesn't automatically mean 48 hours is not enough time to process any evidence they might find, because if forensic processing was completed thoroughly, they can of course release property. But without clarity on what was collected and documented in that window, the timing naturally stands out, at least to me. Now, this is of concern to me because for anyone who doesn't remember, Celeste was identified on September 16, 2025, roughly a week after her remains were discovered. So while the public was still trying to understand who she was, the vehicle connected to her death was already out of police custody, according to Steve Fisher, who provided receipts. And according to Steve, the car also sat in storage for months, accumulating roughly $10,000 in fees. It was eventually scheduled to go to auction, meaning if no one stepped in, the vehicle would have been sold off. But then something interesting happened. In the final hours before that auction, somebody came and picked it up. Not weeks before, not even days before, hours. So it either had to be David himself, which would seem unlikely given everything going on, or someone legally authorized to act on his behalf. And once again, the timing of course matters. This was the car that Celeste was found in. This was a vehicle that had already been processed, released, sitting in storage, accumulating.
Yeah, I ain't gonna lie, that's looking kind of bad because your car finna get auctioned off and, you end up getting a vehicle and then next thing you know, it's the same vehicle that's, I can see if the car was just left stranded for like a couple of years, but he's been dealing with this car since that happened. So like, You feel me? He should be the number one target the whole time. He should have been a target the whole time, man.
Fees, and right before it goes public, somebody comes and picks it up. And then came a follow-up to this particular information. According to Steve, the vehicle wasn't just retrieved. Ownership was apparently transferred. Steve stated that someone presented paperwork and legally took possession and moved the car out of David's name.
That's weird. Oh yeah, that's sketchy as hell. So David transferred the ownership of the vehicle right before a 14-year-old girl is found dead in that same vehicle. A girl that used to date. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? So this is looking crazy. Now that is sketchy as hell. No lie.
He claims to have verified that through DMV records. Now again, this information comes from a private investigator's public statements, not the LAPD. But if that sequence of information is all accurate, that's where a lot of questions come in. If a vehicle is central to a murder investigation, what's standard protocol? How long is evidence typically retained? Is there a minimum hold period in high-profile cases like this? Or does it simply depend on whether forensic processing is completed? And is 48 hours typical? Because a vehicle isn't just one piece of evidence, it's a contained environment. Because here's the thing, this right here isn't just a car. This was the last known physical space connected to a 14-year-old girl whose death is being investigated as a murder. So when you really think about that, fingerprints, DNA swabs, trace fibers, digital system data, especially in a Tesla, location history, can all of that realistically?
Yeah, then Tesla's got cameras, you know, back cameras and like all type of cameras in it. So, you know, which they said was there was no footage, you know, of any of that stuff when they got the Tesla. So this looking all around sketchy. I'm not gonna lie. They need to lock his ass up. Just lock him up until he confess or something.
Be processed, documented, and preserved only within 48 hours? I guess law enforcement would know more than me, right? Maybe if the authorities prioritized this case and moved very quickly, it's of course possible. But we've also seen other major cases, like the YNW Melly case, where the vehicle the rapper was in became a major forensic battleground and remained central evidence for an extended period of time. I'm not saying the cases are the same, of course not. I'm saying when a vehicle is central to a murder investigation, people naturally expect thorough preservation. And the LAPD hasn't publicly detailed what was collected, when it was collected, or why the timeline made sense. So what we're left with is this sequence: discovery, 2 days later, release, months in storage, auction scheduled, last minute retrieval, ownership transfer.
I tried a ton of AI work tools. Then I tried Monday.com. Game over.
When you line it up like that, it's...
Yeah, I ain't gonna lie. All that shit in between them finding her and auctions and 48 hours hold and title transfers, that's where shit gets kind of like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, you know, it's just looking like, you know, it's like someone just trying to build lots of loops to be able to get to who actually did this. You know, so, man, it seemed like David, I don't know if he must have hired somebody to do all this different shit, because ain't no way he was working alone.
It's hard not to ask questions. And again, I'm not jumping to conclusions. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I am just asking questions. I'm simply acknowledging that when you line these events up, the timing stands out. And in cases like this, timing, of course, matters. Because while the Tesla timeline is still being questioned, which has not been formally addressed by law enforcement yet, something major just became public. Newly unsealed court documents now describe David, by his real name David Burke, as the target of a Los Angeles County grand jury investigation tied to Celeste's death. Now that was the word used in these documents: target. And in grand jury language, that word carries weight. It usually means prosecutors believe they have strong evidence connecting that person to the alleged crime. Now the documents go even further. They state he may have committed a criminal offense in California, specifically one count of murder. Now pause there for a second, because up until now this case has been very quiet publicly, and we've been sitting with that silence without any real confirmation about where David stands in all of this. And here's some further context. The reason why these documents surfaced is because of the legal fight involving his parents and brother that I told you about earlier, the same family members who were ordered to appear before the grand jury. And through those documents we also learned more about what it looked like when they found Celeste's body in the Tesla. When police opened the front trunk of the Tesla on September 8th, 2025, after a worker reported a strong smell coming from from the vehicle, they found a black cadaver bag inside, which is essentially another word for a body bag. Inside that bag were Celeste's remains. Police partially unzipped it and found a decomposed head and torso. There was also a second bag underneath the first one, which contained the rest of her dismembered body parts. This is all in the court documents, and the details are obviously extremely grim, man.
Yeah, so they chopped this girl up into pieces, found in your trunk, and you had nothing to do with it? Yeah, lock his ass up, torture him. No, that's doing too much. Not torture him. We need to get to, man, he should have been a target this whole time. It seemed like he went to great measurements to, not get caught. But, he's a target now. So they're on his ass, man. They need to, I really want to see how this situation unfolds.
Even reading through all this is hard to process, but it's important to lay this out clearly because this isn't rumor or speculation. This is the reality of what happened to this little girl. So I guess now the question becomes, where does that leave us? Even though information has felt scarce at times, there obviously has been movement. Witnesses are being called to appear, including his friend who was taken into custody in Montana, one of his managers.
Yeah, so all this shit is happening. They're not really releasing a lot of information, but they are releasing information. And they just don't want the witnesses to be, trying to hide evidence. They don't want the public, they're not just trying to raise suspicion. They probably trying to make it seem like David's all in the good. So, maybe hopefully he slips up or something like that. It's kind of seemed like what's going on here.
As well, and even his immediate family members. And now David is officially labeled as a target in this murder investigation. At the end of the day, that is progress. And whether people realize it or not, cases like this don't just freeze. They move forward. Now that could mean charges against David, or it could mean no charges. I guess we'll see, right? But one thing is clear. This case has entered a new phase. Not the speculative phase, not the social media phase, the legal phase. And I truly hope Celeste eventually gets justice because obviously no child deserves to lose their life like this.
Yeah, man. Justice for Celeste. And I don't know, this David guy, I just don't like him. Look at that picture. Just like, he just looks like I just don't like him. Nah, I just don't. But I feel like he should be locked up, lock everybody connected to him until we figure this shit out. First of all, he was dating a 14-year-old. You're a PDF file, so lock his ass up for that. You feel me? Until, you know what I'm saying, bring one of y'all little informants into his cell, make his ass, you know what I'm saying, beat that nigga ass until he, you know what I'm saying, admit, some shit, or even the other guy that they're bringing to court, the Asian guy, he probably knows something about something too. We need this information, but, justice for Celeste, for sure, though. For sure.
At the center of all this is still a 14-year-old girl who lost her life, man. That's what matters. Everything else, the headlines, the debates.
Facts on facts. But y'all think, good thing is, what's his name? David. He's a target now. So hopefully that means they got some type of information. That's what it seemed like. They got some type of information, and they're going to, get down to the bottom of this. Justice for Celeste. No teenager should be, brutally murdered like that. And, no parent should have to bury the kid. But let me know what y'all think about this, man. Like, comment, subscribe, turn on the post notifications.